Hello, my dear friends. I hope this message finds you in good spirits and that your day unfolds with joy, clarity, and a little bit of unexpected magic. Wherever you are and whatever you're facing, I'm grateful you're here with me today. Let's begin, and I want to speak to you directly, clearly, and without the filters that Western media so carefully layers over the truth. I am Larry C. Johnson. And what I am about to lay out is the reality of this conflict as it stands today. Almost everything that matters in global geopolitics now runs through the battlefield in Ukraine and the diplomatic chaos surrounding it. The war has become the pressure point where Western illusions collide with Russian strategy, and every attempt to cover this truth with slogans or artificial optimism is now collapsing under its own weight. I want you to understand something fundamental. While European leaders shuffle between capitals drafting imaginary peace proposals, and while Washington calibrates its messaging from one day to the next, Russia is not improvising. Russia is executing a long-term strategy built on attrition, patience, structural advantage, and a clear understanding of its national interests. And the West, rather than facing this, negotiates with itself, argues with itself, contradicts itself, and still refuses to confront what Moscow has already made unmistakably clear. Let me begin with Europe. A small cluster of countries, Italy, Belgium, Malta, Bulgaria, and likely Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic now stands in opposition to the EU's reckless plan to launch a €140 billion loan for Ukraine using indefinitely frozen Russian assets as collateral. Think about what that means. It means the EU has decided that property rights no longer matter, that national vetoes no longer matter, and that law itself no longer matters if it gets in the way of punishing Russia. Viktor Orban has said plainly that using emergency powers to override Hungary's veto is illegal and beyond any acceptable level of political conduct, and, on this point, he is absolutely right. Yet the EU's central leadership, Scholz, von der Leyen, Weber, pushes ahead, determined to impose this project regardless of the consequences. In London, Keir Starmer moves in lockstep, eager to seize Russian assets frozen in Britain despite explicit warnings from the City of London. And Belgium, for daring to hesitate, is now being quietly isolated, its officials ignored, its leadership placed in a kind of diplomatic exile until they bend or break. This is the West claiming to defend democracy while abandoning every democratic principle it pretends to represent. And I want to speak to you directly, clearly, and without the filters that Western media so carefully layers over the truth. I am Larry C. Johnson, and what I am about to lay out is the reality of this conflict as it stands today. Almost everything that matters in global geopolitics now runs through the battlefield in Ukraine and the diplomatic chaos surrounding it. The war has become the pressure point where Western illusions collide with Russian strategy, and every attempt to cover this truth with slogans or artificial optimism is now collapsing under its own weight. I want you to understand something fundamental. While European leaders shuffle between capitals drafting imaginary peace proposals, and while Washington calibrates its messaging from one day to the next, Russia is not improvising. Russia is executing a long-term strategy built on attrition, patience, structural advantage, and a clear understanding of its national interests. And the West, rather than facing this, negotiates with itself, argues with itself, contradicts itself, and still refuses to confront what Moscow has already made unmistakably clear. Let me begin with Europe. A small cluster of countries, Italy, Belgium, Malta, Bulgaria, and likely Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic now stands in opposition to the EU's reckless plan to launch a €140 billion loan for Ukraine using indefinitely frozen Russian assets as collateral. Think about what that means. It means the EU has decided that property rights no longer matter, that national vetoes no longer matter, and that law itself no longer matters if it gets in the way of punishing Russia. Viktor Orban has said plainly that using emergency powers to override Hungary's veto is illegal and beyond any acceptable level of political conduct, and on this point, he is absolutely right. Yet the EU's central leadership, Scholes, von der Leyen, Weber, pushes ahead, determined to impose this project regardless of the consequences. In London, Keir Starmer moves in lockstep, eager to seize Russian assets frozen in Britain despite explicit warnings from the City of London. And Belgium, for daring to hesitate, is now being quietly isolated, its officials ignored, its leadership placed in a kind of diplomatic exile until they bend or break. This is the West claiming to defend democracy while abandoning every democratic principle it pretends to represent. And while this is happening, Western diplomats keep spinning tales of unity, even as Kyiv feeds them contradictory messages every 24 hours. One day, Ukraine insists it will never withdraw from Donbass, must have the right to join NATO, and refuses any reduction of its armed forces. The next day, Ukraine says it will temporarily shelve NATO membership, but only if the United States signs legally binding Article 5 equivalent guarantees that would effectively make Ukraine a U.S. military protectorate. And unbelievably, some in Washington seem ready to consider this. Let me be clear, Moscow will never accept that, and anyone claiming otherwise is living in a fantasy world. Then comes the Ukrainian idea of a demilitarized zone in Donbass, where both sides pull back, but Kyiv maintains control over the territory it still holds. This is not a withdrawal. It is a frozen conflict designed to lock Russia into a stalemate while NATO rearms Ukraine behind a shield of Western guarantees. And Russia has already said no, repeatedly, unequivocally. I want you to understand Russia's position because Western media refuses to state it clearly. Moscow's stance is Istanbul Plus, and it includes the following core demands: full and internationally recognized transfer of the 4 new regions to Russia, deep reductions in Ukrainian military strength, binding security arrangements, giving Russia veto power over foreign deployments on Ukrainian soil, a legally enforced permanent ban on NATO membership for Ukraine, constitutional neutrality, restoration of the rights of Russian speakers across Ukraine, reinstatement of the Russian language, reestablishment of the canonical Orthodox Church, elimination of extremist nationalist structures, denuclearization, and the complete lifting of all sanctions imposed since 2014. These are not vague concepts. These are explicit, consistently reiterated conditions. Western analysts call this maximalist, but they deliberately ignore the only question that matters. Why would Russia soften its terms when its military position is improving while Ukraine's capacity to resist continues to crumble? If anything, Russia may harden its terms, especially now that the EU has taken the unprecedented step of indefinitely freezing Russian assets, an act many jurists classify as economic warfare. And while Western diplomacy circles itself like a dog chasing its tail, Moscow focuses on the battlefield. Russian forces continue making systematic gains. Varvarovka has fallen, Guliaipol is under growing pressure, and Mirnograd appears on the verge of complete collapse. Kupiansk remains effectively encircled, and Ukrainian counterattacks are failing. Even Zelensky's carefully staged visits to frontline locations cannot conceal the reality that territory is shrinking, manpower is evaporating, and morale is deteriorating. At sea, the picture is just as decisive. After repeated Ukrainian attempts to attack merchant shipping in the Black Sea, Russia responded by striking Odessa and even targeting a Turkish vessel docked there, an unmistakable signal that Moscow is prepared to impose a full blockade if pushed further. Putin's firm conversation with Erdogan in Ashgabat made clear that Russia has both the means and the will to close Odessa entirely, and if that happens, the consequences for Ukraine's economy and for European inflation will be severe. Meanwhile, one of the very few Western reporters allowed near Russian positions describes troops who are young, confident, well-supplied, well-trained in drone warfare, and supported by logistics that actually function. This contradicts every Western narrative about Russia running out of manpower, shells, or morale. I have said this before and I will say it again. The assumption that Russia can be outlasted is wrong. It is the West, not Russia, that is running out of time, resources, political coherence, and public support. And while the war grinds on, Europe sinks deeper into economic stagnation. Germany faces a crisis in its car industry. France is sliding into insolvency. The United Kingdom has already entered recession. The United States hides industrial decline behind a speculative stock bubble fueled by AI hype. Yet nobody in power dares say what is obvious. The economic war against Russia is boomeranging, damaging Western economies far more than Russia's. So here is the truth, spoken plainly. Russia holds the initiative militarily, diplomatically, and economically. Western strategies are collapsing under their own contradictions. And unless the West faces reality, the final settlement in Ukraine will be written not by Brussels or Washington, but by Moscow on Russia's terms, at Russia's pace, according to Russia's strategic design, Greece. And I want to look past the noise and focus on what all of this really means for the American empire, for Europe, and above all for the war in Ukraine. Because beneath the headlines and the theatrics, you can see the system cracking. Over the last 24 hours, the Western media has been fixated on 3 shootings. At Brown University in the United States, at Bondi Beach in Australia, and in Syria, where 2 U.S. servicemen and a civilian interpreter were killed. And of course, the political class immediately tries to turn these tragedies into narrative ammunition. Trump rushed to post on Truth Social about the Syria attack, speaking of 3 great American patriots killed in an ISIS strike, adding that the Syrian president, Ahmed al-Shar, whom Washington previously treated as some sort of rebranded jihadist strongman, is now supposedly extremely angry and disturbed and promising very serious retaliation. We are expected to pretend that a man who, not long ago, was being handled in the White House as a convenient proxy, praised for doing a great job, is now an outraged head of state demanding justice for a terrorist attack on U.S. forces. The truth is that all these names, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, HTS, are shuffled and rebranded by Western intelligence agencies as needed. They are tools in a box, labels that can be stuck on or peeled off, depending on the narrative of the day. And when one of those tools, or some splinter of it, turns its guns on U.S. troops, the same politicians who legitimize these actors pretend to be shocked and promise retaliation against a monster they helped create. That alone tells you a lot about the moral bankruptcy of the so-called Pax Americana. And that brings me to a man who stood up in Germany and declared with great drama that Pax Americana is dead, Friedrich Merz, or as some people have started calling him, BlackRock Merz, the latest manifestation of Germany's steady decline in leadership, from the manipulative but competent Merkel to the pliable doormat Scholz, and now to an unstable, erratic figure trying to play statesman while reading lines clearly written by someone else. Merz told his audience that Europe would no longer rely on the United States, that Pax Americana is over. I'll believe that when the 30,000 to 40,000 U.S. troops leave Germany, when the massive U.S. base at Ramstein, the operational brain of the Ukraine conflict, is dismantled and sent home. Until then, his declaration is theater. The audience applauded, the German elites nodded, and everyone pretended that Europe has suddenly discovered sovereignty while it still hosts the infrastructure of American military power and intelligence oversight on its own soil. In the same speech, Merz resorted to the oldest, laziest trope in the Western political playbook. He compared Putin to the mustache man of 1938, as if every moment in history must be squeezed into the same cartoon frame from the 20th century, and as if Germany's political class, of all people, has the moral authority to weaponize that analogy yet again against a Russian leadership that has repeatedly warned, openly and clearly, that NATO's encroachment and the weaponization of Ukraine are existential threats for Moscow. Then Merz moved on to the question of mandatory military service, openly preparing German youth, young men, for now, women, not yet, as he put it, for conscription and future deployment to fight Russia in 2 to 4 years, depending on which American or European hawk you listen to. The United States would like this confrontation accelerated within 2 years. The Europeans still laboring under the illusion that they can buy time to rearm and reindustrialize. Talk about needing four. Either way, Merz made it clear. The German political class is mentally preparing to feed a new generation of young Europeans into a confrontation with a nuclear power. And he dresses this up as duty, defense, and moral necessity. At the same time, he admitted that Germany's economy is falling behind, but he blamed this partially on U.S. tariffs and trade policy, conveniently omitting the other far more obvious factor, the self-inflicted sabotage of Germany's energy security. Exploding pipelines, sanctions on Russian gas, and the destruction of cheap, stable energy contracts have done more to dismantle German industry than any tariff increase from Washington. When a manufacturing powerhouse ends up paying 40 euro cents per kilowatt hour, while competitors like China and even the United States pay a fraction of that, you no longer need a PhD in economics to understand why factories are closing, why investment is leaving, and why the German industrial model is collapsing. And yet, instead of admitting that the economic war on Russia is a central cause of their decline, European politicians like Merz pretend it is all about Trump, tariffs, or vague structural issues, anything but their own decision to burn the bridge to Russian energy in the name of sanctions that have not broken Russia but are breaking Europe. In that context, you also see the hysteria of figures like Poland's Radosław Sikorski, who mocks Viktor Orban for resisting escalation by saying he has earned his Order of Lenin, as if any leader who refuses to drag his country into a catastrophic war with Russia must be labeled a traitor. The Hungarian response is simple and rational. If Warsaw is so determined to fight Russia, let Poland lead the charge. Let Sikorski pick up a rifle and take the first step to the front. Hungary has no interest in being dragged into a suicidal conflict fueled by the fantasies of neoconservatives and Atlanticists who will not pay with their own blood. Meanwhile, on the German side, citizens are responding bluntly to Merz's performance, pointing out that energy prices alone make the current model unsustainable. The deeper truth is this: Europe's political class wants to pretend that it can declare independence from the United States, rhetorically, while remaining utterly dependent in military, financial, and informational terms. They shout that Pax Americana is dead while clinging to U.S. bases, U.S. command structures, U.S. security guarantees, and U.S. CRAST approval. In other words, they want the illusion of sovereignty without the responsibility and risk that true sovereignty demands. Now let's turn to what is happening directly around Ukraine, because here the disconnect between Western propaganda and reality becomes even more glaring. German tabloid Bild, which sometimes stumbles into moments of honesty, is reporting that Trump is pressuring Zelensky to cede land to Russia. In other words, to accept that parts of Donetsk, which Russia will inevitably capture over the next 3 to 6 months, be turned into some kind of demilitarized zone or free economic zone. The idea is to package territorial loss as a clever compromise. 20% of Donetsk is effectively handed over, but under the branding of a DMZ or special zone, rather than open recognition of Russian sovereignty. That is the kind of linguistic trick Western diplomats love. Change the label, pretend the underlying reality hasn't permanently shifted, but Russia has already answered this. Moscow has held referendums, integrated these regions into the Russian Federation, and considers them as Russian as any other region in the country. From the Kremlin's point of view, there is nothing to negotiate over in these territories. No DMZ, no free economic zone, no creative transitional status. The decision has been taken and formalized. We've already gone through referendums in Crimea, in Lugansk, in Donetsk. Is the unambiguous Russian message. We're not going back to the ambiguity that led us here. So while Washington and Kyiv sit together and try to stage a negotiation among themselves, talking about how close they are to an internal deal, Nothing in that process changes Moscow's stance. Ukraine is a protectorate. The United States pays the salaries of officials, officers, parliamentarians, Western agencies, coordinate intelligence, weapons supply, and operational planning out of Kyiv. The notion that Washington lacks leverage over Zelensky is absurd. The problem is not leverage. The problem is that Zelensky's role is to act as both victim and veto, to absorb pressure from the West while publicly refusing any settlement that acknowledges Russian gains. He says no for show, so that Western politicians can say, we respect Ukrainian sovereignty, even as they control the entire apparatus of the Ukrainian state. We now see Zelensky flying into Berlin to meet with U.S. envoys like Witkoff and Kushner before sitting down with the big three European leaders, Merz, Macron, and Starmer, a trio I would describe as three stooges of a decaying system. Poland, despite its aggressive rhetoric and constant calls for escalation, is conspicuously absent from this inner negotiation circle. Warsaw is good enough to shout and posture, but not trusted enough to sit at the real table where Washington and Europe attempt to coordinate a face-saving outcome. The agenda in Berlin is simple: how to dress up territorial losses as a DMZ, how to manufacture a narrative of peace with honor, while quietly conceding that Russia will hold what it has taken and likely take more. But again, Russia has already signaled that these constructs are dead on arrival. No demilitarized Donetsk under Ukrainian or international control. No pseudo-referendums. No backdoor NATO footholds disguised as peacekeeping missions. The regions that voted to join Russia will remain in Russia, and any settlement that ignores that will be rejected. On the ground, the Russian military continues to advance. The fighting in Guliapol in the Zaporozhye direction remains intense, with Russian forces pressing into the town from the east and northeast, slowly grinding down Ukrainian defenses and working toward full control. This is not flashy blitzkrieg. It is systematic, deliberate, and based on attrition, exactly the type of warfare that favors a state with Russia's industrial and demographic depth over a broken, externally funded proxy. Around Kupiansk, the propaganda war has been just as fierce as the artillery exchanges. Zelensky filmed himself in a carefully framed Instagram or TikTok video 2 kilometers outside the city limits, claiming to prove that Putin lied when he said Russia had captured Kupiansk. Russian sources responded by sending a reconnaissance drone over the area shown in the video and pointed out the discrepancies. Damaged netting, a battered road sign, terrain that simply does not match the clean, composed images Zelensky presented. Maybe the Ukrainian president was on that spot days or weeks earlier. Maybe it was staged elsewhere. Maybe it was edited. In the end, it doesn't matter. These clips are not serious military indicators. They are public relations stunts designed to convince Trump, Kellogg, Witkoff, Kushner, and other Western decision makers that Ukraine is still resisting heroically and therefore deserves endless money and arms. That is not how wars are won. That is how wars are spun. We are told that Ukraine is mounting a successful counteroffensive in Kupiansk and smashing Russian units, while Russian reports say Ukrainian troops are being ground down and their assaults shattered. Give it a day or two, and the truth will be visible in the map and the casualty lists, not in the rhetoric. The deeper point is that Kyiv keeps trying to substitute image for substance. A president with a smartphone on the front line cannot change the fact that the strategic trend is running against Ukraine, that the mobilization base is exhausted, and that Russia continues to apply pressure along a wide front. Behind the military theater, the economic war over frozen Russian assets continues, and here again we see how deeply the European Union is willing to dig its own grave. Brussels is now facing a lawsuit in Russian courts over the indefinitely frozen assets at Euroclear. The EU's economy commissioner, Valdis Dombrovskis, has already tried to dismiss this as speculative. declaring that the assets fall under EU jurisdiction and that what the EU is doing is fully compatible with international law. And what exactly is Brussels doing? Freezing Russian sovereign funds forever, insisting that since they are not formally seizing them, merely immobilizing them without time limit, they have the right to treat those assets as collateral, to borrow against them, and to use those loans to fund Ukraine. In other words, they insist they are not stealing, they are just freezing for eternity and leveraging the frozen property for their own political purposes. If you are a government today and you hold reserves in the European Union, this is the message you are meant to internalize. At any point, your funds can be frozen forever on political grounds, and there is nothing you can do about it because Brussels will say it is within its jurisdiction and therefore lawful. That is not a rules-based order. That is financial banditry dressed up as virtue. It is no surprise that leaders like the Czech Prime Minister Babiš are starting to push back. He has aligned himself with Belgium, Hungary, Malta, Bulgaria, and Italy in saying that the frozen assets plan is dangerous and foolish, and he has stated clearly that Czech money must now go first and foremost to domestic priorities, not to Ukraine's war effort. And you can already imagine Zelensky's outrage behind closed doors. How dare a European leader redirect his own taxpayers' money to his own citizens instead of the cause in Kyiv? For years, Ukraine was treated as the central moral project of the EU. Now, voters at home are suffering, and politicians like Babiš are starting to realize that their first responsibility is not to a corrupt regime in Kyiv, but to their own people. That small shift in thinking is a crack in the facade of unity the EU tries to project. Even the clownish details of this system tell a story. The president of Poland arrives in Latvia on an official visit and is greeted with a dirty car, an unwashed state vehicle presented as his transport. The Latvians blame bad weather. The Polish presidency is offended. On the surface, it is a trivial incident, but symbolically, it fits the pattern. A bloc that cannot maintain its infrastructure, cannot clean a car for a head of state, and yet imagines it can run a war of attrition against Russia, rewrite global financial rules, and dictate the security architecture of Eurasia. This is not a serious elite. This is an exhausted class pretending to still be in control. Step back and look at the larger picture. The United States insists it is fighting for democracy in Ukraine, even as it works with and legitimizes the same extremist figures it once placed bounties on in Syria. European leaders pretend to be breaking free from Pax Americana while hosting U.S. troops, following U.S. orders, and begging Washington to back their every move. Germany lectures Russia about history while deindustrializing itself by severing energy ties with the one country that kept its factories competitive. Poland howls for war while being quietly excluded from the real decision-making rooms. Brussels claims to defend international law while normalizing the indefinite freezing and effective expropriation of sovereign assets. And through it all, Russia advances slowly, methodically, relentlessly on the battlefield, consolidates its political control over the territories it has absorbed, strengthens its ties with the global South, and watches as the West burns through its own legitimacy and wealth. I am Larry C. Johnson, and my conclusion is simple. This is not the story of a confident, unified West confronting a rogue power. It is the story of a declining empire lashing out, improvising, and lying to itself while the strategic balance of power moves, step by step, in Russia's favor.